Excellent. Well, these are the synergies that as a professor make me happy. And I know, my colleagues, so I'll, without further ado, introduce my old friend, Gary Hughes, who I met when I was in college and he was in graduate school, and we were both in Montana. Pretty far. And that was a long time ago for both of us, but even at that point, Gary and I coincided in an organization that was focused on environmental and social justice activities and advocacy, mostly in Latin America, but also in the United States as well. And it was in that space that we got to know each other, and then, went off and continued our respective lives and careers. And through many twists and turns, I ended up in front of you. And through very different and very, very interesting twists and turns, Gary took his graduate degree from the University of Montana, where he was squarely focused on environmental issues, and built an entire career around research, public education, and advocacy related to overconsumption, a term you know well, right? But more broadly, sort of the intersection between environmental issues, climate change, deforestation, what have you, and social issues, right? This is a social problems class, but the point I've tried to make over and over, and I think hopefully I've convinced you by now that environmental problems are social problems as well. So Gary, after 20, 30 years in this field, working for several different organizations, I have the pleasure of inviting him today to talk about the work that he's doing right now with an organization called Biofuelwatch, and specifically the analysis and public education that they're doing around aviation and the aviation industry. So this is a really excellent case. He's a global expert on the matter, and I think you all will see a lot of connections to the things that we read about. Okay, so we'll turn the floor over to him, let him present on this work. Hold your questions, and then at the end, we should have time for you to ask questions about what he presented on, or even just sort of his trajectory, if that's interesting for you. Okay, awesome. The floor is yours, Gary.
Thank you so much, Dr. McColeman. Actually, it's really an honor to be here, and I do have so much respect, Leslie, for what I learned from you when we were organizing together in Montana, and then also just to see how you've been able to continue the work as well. And it's really very cool for me to be joining your class and to join students at Ohio Wesleyan University. This, just to make sure that everyone knows, this is the second time now that I've joined the class, and I did pretty much a similar presentation in the fall, but I have tightened it up a little bit, and I've added a little bit more even technical information because I felt like the students were ready for it. But it's, in some ways it's the same, but a little bit different, this presentation right here. But we really are focusing on overconsumption, really trying to dig into aviation and mobility and the injustices in the climate damage, in particular, the environmental harms arising from the aviation sector, and then how that reflects what we call an extreme carbon equality on a global level, but also within the US. So I have about 30 slides to go through. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen on it. Hopefully that'll help everyone see what we have. And I'm going to be attentive to time. I'd like to do this in about 30 minutes, so we still have a little bit of time for some questions afterwards. So first off, just a little bit about myself. I'm joining you today from San Francisco East Bay, Ohlone territory, South Berkeley, right on the border with Oakland. How I ended up in the Bay Area is interesting, but I do have family roots here. My dad finished his military service here in California back in the 1960s, and I lived here. And then in Humboldt County, I have very strong Humboldt County roots. My daughter was born in Humboldt County, but my wife and daughter and I, we live here in the Bay now. And I've worked extensively on environmental and human rights issues, as Leslie had hinted. This photo is from Chile in 2008. So one of the issues that I worked on most strongly for many years was fighting mega hydroelectric development, giant dams, which can totally transform rivers and entire landscapes. And I continue to work internationally quite a bit, but my my life is much more mundane now, which I enjoy immensely. I'm not traveling as much, though. I still do have plans to return to Chile later this year. But I'd like to share a little bit about Biofuelwatch as well. So you all know we're a very small organization. I'm not going to hide that from you. I've worked for big organizations. I've worked for small organizations. Biofuelwatch, we have a small group of people really trying to get people involved on these issues around the human rights and environmental harms arising from large-scale industrial bioenergy. And we just see a massive pivot towards bioenergy, the use of biological material, biomass to generate energy. It's justified as a climate solution, but unfortunately, there are really tragic environmental issues associated with this and lots of human rights and governance concerns. Just for those who are interested in working in this business, I say that it can be very satisfying. You can do a lot of creative space, but it can also be challenging. So I don't want anyone to have any inaccurate assumptions of what it means to work in this field. But fortunately enough, we've been able to carve out a little space. And we work very closely with Global Justice Ecology Project, which is an organization that I've been close to. I've known the people for like some 30 years. So that helps a lot. We have a really tight community type feel to our work. So what I am going to do here then is I've got this presentation, as Leslie said, where I want to focus on aviation. I want to talk about the inequities around aviation, but then I'm going to go down into detail on one aspect in particular of how the aviation industry is trying to convince the public that they're addressing their climate damage, and that's through the use of what we will call aviation biofuels. And we'll then finish really briefly, though, looking at some of the options that we have for addressing these concerns. And so then what I've done for this presentation in particular is tried to really elevate the involvement that Biofuelwatch has with the Stay Grounded network. And this is largely a European base, but it's a global network, but it's mostly young people in Europe that have come together to really push back on the growth of the aviation industry, to really educate the public about the climate harms arising from flying, and to really work together to find alternatives and to develop just alternatives for mobility. And then the Stay Grounded network focuses very strongly on what we call a just transition. This is a term that's bandied about a lot now. It's kind of being appropriated by extractive industry, but the idea of just transition is that we're able to make this transition from a fossil fuel powered society to a more renewable energy powered society. But in general, really, that we all kind of slow down, stay grounded, and understand that it is our overconsumption that's driving, a lot of the problems on this planet, both environmentally and socially. So I'll use a lot of stay grounded materials in this presentation. So we're going to start getting into the real meat, as it were, of the issue here. And this is the carbon inequality, the extreme carbon inequality. So I have a couple of slides here to really describe how it's really just the richest of the rich that are responsible for the greatest amount of carbon emissions. So we call this the champagne glass graph, where by this research that was done by Oxfam, you can see that the poorest 50% of the world's population is really only responsible for about 10% of emissions, whereas the richest 10% is responsible for almost 50% of global emissions. And then we can see that again in this graph. This also comes from Oxfam research looking at the growth in emissions as well as cumulative emissions. But we've seen how the wealthiest 5% in particular, but the wealthiest 10% are not only consuming the products that are causing the most emissions, but they're growth in consumption of these products has also been much higher than anyone else on the planet. And then to drive home again that the poorest 50% of people on the planet are responsible for only 6% of total emissions growth. So this is a disparity that we try to elevate a great deal when we talk about aviation, because addressing the climate harms from aviation is a dilemma. A lot of us are dependent on aviation. We need to have a managed transition, as it were, but we want to drive home the fact that it is the super wealthy that are burning up the planet by flying. So here's another graph. This is an example of the work that Stay Grounded is doing, where they're taking academic material and trying to translate it into graphics and material that's easily understood by the public. But this is when we come strictly, not only just about carbon emissions, but just strictly aviation. We can see in this graph that 1% of the world's population, because of the frequent flying habits, is responsible for 50% of commercial aviation emissions. Where the other thing that we really think is a sobering fact for folks to remember is that 80% of the world's population has never set foot on an airplane. There are lots of people that work in airports all around the world that never fly. They've got the jobs that are tough, hard, thankless, of cleaning bathrooms, making food, washing dishes, sweeping floors, all that kind of stuff. This is an example, though, that those folks will never fly. So those of us who do fly, we are amongst the elite. But then once again, this graph can drive it home that it's really those who are wealthy enough to fly essentially all the time that are driving the growth in consumption. So in this graph, we can see that even in the US, and this is from the International Council on Clean Transportation, which can be a really good source of data and research on these matters. But even here in the US, 50% of adults in a given year won't even get on a plane. There's about 35% of adults who will fly 1 to 5 times, and that makes up, about 30% of the trips that happen every year. But almost 70% of trips every year are being taken by only 12% of adults. So again, right about that 10% number again of folks who are really responsible for the huge majority of the pollution that occurs from flying. That said, it's, any one flight is really very damaging to the environment. And so this graph from Stay Grounded as well really tries to graphically demonstrate how one flight can be as much or even more than the carbon footprint of certain individuals living in this graph, for instance, in countries such as India or Uganda. So there is no faster way to fry the planet than to fly. It is incredibly energy intensive, and it requires an immense amount of fuel to put a jet plane through the air. And so, with Stay Grounded, we're really trying to elevate this information so that people can begin to engage on these matters in an informed manner. One of the things, though, that gets really technical that we try to be careful with folks for understanding, but we do want to ensure that is taken into consideration when developing policy, is that it's not only the carbon emissions that cause the climate damage from flying. When we burn fuel at high altitudes, there are a whole handful of climate forcing impacts that come from the other elements of the emissions, not just the carbon. So we can basically estimate that flying now is 3 times as impactful for the climate when it comes to warming than the impacts of the carbon dioxide alone. So this is a slide that's really very technical, and it does get into some matters that actually we're not even speaking about in this presentation, in terms of how climate science and climate policy and climate politics have really started to launch ahead into some spaces around what they call radiative forcing management, or even then we're seeing discussions of geoengineering now about solar radiation management and somehow being able to intervene in the upper atmosphere and to reflect sun away from the planet. I'm not going to go deep onto that, but it's actually a lot of the science around studying aviation that has given people information to both, understand the risks of those types of speculative technologies, but also to really understand how complicated it is in the atmosphere when we burn fuel at a high altitude. But ultimately, there's a whole bunch of elements beyond just the CO2 that can really increase the warming. And it's something that we try to get people to understand that, again, as I said earlier, that it's about 3 times more damaging to the climate than just the carbon dioxide emissions alone. So there's a whole bunch of technical information right there about aviation. I've kind of gone through it. I'm going to start to pivot now a little bit into the politics around the aviation sector, the climate politics, but also the economic politics. So I've shared with you a number of slides here trying to describe some of the climate harms that have been identified associated with aviation. The aviation industry is highly aware of the fact that the public is growing increasingly conscious about how flying can damage the climate, can damage the environment. And the industry is really actually kind of freaking out. And the shutdown that went with the pandemic only drove the industry into even a greater panic. And so as there's this increased public understanding of the serious climate impacts from aviation, the sector is just scrambling to keep people buying tickets. And what they've done basically is resort now to 5 basic tactics of greenwash to convince people that it's okay to keep flying, that there is a solution just around the corner that is going to magically make all of the problems with flying go away. So don't worry about it, people. Keep flying, keep buying tickets. Don't worry about it, people. And this is what we are going to start to get into now to finish up this slideshow. To go through these really quick and why we believe that these are false solutions. The first thing about aircraft efficiency, a lot of time the industry will talk about how the airplanes are getting more and more and more efficient. But when it comes to cumulative emissions, it doesn't really matter if you have more efficient planes, if even more of them are flying. So, of course, efficiencies are really important, but it's not adequate to address climate issues if that efficiency for aircraft is being used to get people to buy more tickets and to make more flights. The electric flight and hydrogen flight categories are basically unicorns. They're kind of Jetson type. I guess if people understand the Jetson reference, it's an old cartoon from when I was a kid where, people lived in a really science fiction-y future where they had hovercrafts and, they could, do all these fancy things with technology. And that's what the aviation industry has tried to do, is tell people, well, we have electric airplanes and hydrogen powered airplanes, just around the corner. But everyone who's looked at this very closely, including the people in the aviation industry developing these technologies, has said we are decades away, if ever, being able to have planes that really can move people with electric propulsion or with hydrogen propulsion. One topic that I'm going to get into deeply here in this presentation is the alternative jet fuels, or the sustainable aviation fuel. That's the aviation biofuels. That's where I'm going to go with. But first, I wanted to check in really briefly on the market-based measures. In particular for aviation, what we're really talking about is the use of offsets, carbon offsets, the idea that another action in another place at another time can compensate for the climate pollution that is occurring from flying. So there are lots of opportunities for those who are flying to buy offsets to ostensibly compensate or neutralize the pollution that occurs from flying. Biofuelwatch works with a number of global networks, one in particular. I've mentioned Stay Grounded, but we also work very closely with the Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance. And this is a global alliance. We call it CLADA. And we've gone really deep within these spaces to look at the false equivalencies, the dubious science, and the injustices associated with offsetting. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on offsets or any time really on offsets in this presentation, but I wanted to make sure that we at least briefly touched upon this issue of the market-based mechanisms and the way the aviation industry uses the kind of myth of offsets to keep people flying. Hey, it's okay. I can just buy offsets and makes my trip to Cancun for spring break, totally environmentally friendly, which couldn't be further from the truth. But we have had to campaign really hard on these matters here in California because the state of California, is considered a global climate leader. But these mechanisms of pollution trading are so present in so many aspects of California's climate and environmental management. And all we've seen are injustices and failures to actually bring real world emissions down. So we had a big battle here in California for some time trying to keep a tropical forest offset standard from being approved by the state government. It ended up getting approved, but it's still been kind of, we were able to kind of keep it limited in its impact. But these are major campaigns that, for the most part, we've lost on, unfortunately, because these market-based mechanisms are so prevalent now. Just to really quickly say, we are oftentimes stuck politically between, the total climate science denial, for instance, of the Trump alt-right, burn the earth up and find another one later type approach, or the very neoliberal, very business friendly, very fossil fuel industry friendly approach that comes from the Democrats that tend to really rely very heavily on market mechanisms and other sorts of twisting the dial and turning the knob type approaches to climate that aren't getting the real world reductions that we need. So I've gone through, some stuff about aviation, the climate impacts from aviation, and I kind of did a little bit of outline about the different ways that the aviation industry is trying to greenwash their impacts and assuage public concern, and to keep people flying and to keep the public from demanding massive changes in how we move ourselves around. But what I want to do now is go really deep on this whole issue of aviation biofuels, which we are seeing emerge strongly here in California. So we like to put it out there for folks because I mentioned that term transition or just transition, and originally just transition really comes from the grassroots. It's almost an anti-capitalist perspective that we're going to transition from a capitalist extractive economy to a more inclusive and earth-friendly economy. But now we've seen that the term just transition has been captured by the energy sector to suggest that by transitioning from making fuels from petroleum to making biofuels constitutes a just transition. And our argument is that no, that's not a transition, it's a trap. Okay, so the example I really want to share for folks is that right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, this is one of the biggest refining sectors in the Western United States, one of the biggest on the Pacific Rim. And there are 5 major refineries right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're all located up along this northern edge of the bay into the Bay Delta. And this is what we call the refinery corridor. And I work a great deal with all of the communities up through here who are on the front lines and who are dealing with the constant pollution and damage from these refineries right here in Green, California. But what we've seen since the summer of 2020, because 2020 with the pandemic shutdown, people stopped flying, people stopped driving, and there was what they call demand destruction. Suddenly, people weren't buying the liquid fuels that are coming from these refineries, and they were forced into pretty major sorts of kind of reductions of production, including the fact that the Marathon refinery way back at the back end of the bay had to shut down altogether. But it's the Marathon refinery now and the Phillips 66 refinery in Rodeo. With the Phillips 66 refinery did not have to shut down, but they are now both deeply into this transition where they are converting from processing petroleum to make liquid fuels to processing vegetable oils, animal tallow, and other sorts of feedstocks to make these liquid biofuels. Just really quickly, so you can see, this is the Phillips 66 refinery in Rodeo. Anyone who knows something about the geography of California might be interested to know that every single salmon from the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers has to go right through here. This is the Carquinez Strait. This is a heavily industrialized spot, Selby Slag. There was a massive gold smelter here that operated for more than a century. The really heavily industrialized area. But what is encouraging these refineries to make this pivot to the liquid biofuels? It's basically climate policy. The federal renewable fuel standard offers subsidies to the producers of these biofuels, and then the California low carbon fuel standard also offers very lucrative pathways for a producer of these fuels where they're able to ostensibly lower the carbon intensity overall of the transportation fuels that they're providing. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, that's really driving this refinery sector conversion to biofuels is the aviation greenwash and the CORSIA mechanism, which means Carbon Offset Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, which has been brought forth by a UN-associated body called the International Civil Aviation Organization. So the aviation industry on a global level is really responsible for making this push towards the liquid biofuels. And it's because they want to make what they call sustainable aviation fuel. So this is a photo of the Phillips 66 refinery in Rodeo that's in this process of converting to make it liquid biofuels. There's two main products that they're going to get from this refinery, and hopefully people can remember these names. One is renewable diesel. They call it renewable. It's not really renewable, but the idea of renewable diesel is you can take a soy oil or animal tallow or other not very abundant feedstocks, but they do get used, such as used cooking oil, and they will make a renewable diesel, which is a diesel fuel that is a drop-in diesel fuel. It doesn't have to be blended with any petroleum-based diesel, and it doesn't require that the vehicle or the diesel engine be modified to accept this fuel. So the renewable diesel is a complete substitute for diesel. And then the other fuel that they're making here is what they call sustainable aviation fuel, which is very similar to renewable diesel, though it takes more feedstock and more processing to end up with the final liquid fuel. The difference with sustainable aviation fuel being that it must be mixed at least a 50% level with petroleum-based jet fuel. Now, I mentioned the idea of lower carbon intensity. The makers of these fuels will contend that because they're using like a vegetable oil or a fat oil or grease type feedstock, that there is a lower carbon intensity for this fuel. But in wrestling fiercely with the California Air Resources Board in the environmental permitting of these refinery conversions, what we found is that the state authorities are refusing to recognize the emissions intensity of making these fuels. And so what really happens at a refinery like Phillips 66 is this is old school technology. And in these refineries, they have a unit that they call a hydrocracker, and they need to crack the feedstocks to be able to break them down, the molecules down, remove the oxygen, and ultimately to arrive at this liquid fuel. But that process requires huge amounts of hydrogen. And all of that hydrogen comes from the steam reformation of natural gas, or what's better called fossil gas. So what we want to leave people with is the understanding that making a fuel like sustainable aviation fuel requires huge amounts of fossil fuels. It's not a fossil fuel free process by any means whatsoever. And that the carbon emissions from making a liquid biofuel like sustainable aviation fuel is as carbon intensive, or actually even more emissions intensive than making these fuels from petroleum. So it's not really a transition. And this is one of the reasons we say that this is a trap, because these fuels are not as climate friendly as government authorities and the industrial sector who's making them wants the public to believe. So it's more than just the refining that's at the heart of the problem. In California, it's really clear that the major feedstock that's available for making these fuels is soy vegetable oil. Now, I mentioned used cooking oil. This is, popular in terms of what could be a really sustainable feedstock. The idea that you can use the oil from having cooked your French fries and make a fuel from it. And it's true. It's actually the feedstock that could be considered truly sustainable, but it's very constrained. There's just not enough of it to make the amount of fuel that's needed. It's such a tiny amount of used cooking oil. We couldn't eat enough fish and chips to ever make the amount of fuel that people need to power airplanes, for instance, as we're talking. So inevitably, when they try to start scaling up the making of these fuels, they're going to rely on soy oil. Here in the United States, it's soy oil, it's canola oil, distilled corn oil, all of these different commodities. And it is really important to recognize that soy is a high deforestation risk commodity. Okay, and why is it a high deforestation risk commodity? Well, people might talk about what we call direct land use changes, where a soy producer goes to the tropical rainforest and cuts it down to plant their soy, and then you use that soy in your fuel. But what we want to make sure that people understand is that there's a lot of indirect land use change, and that there's a lot of market elasticity that makes it so that you don't necessarily have to directly be responsible for the deforestation, because it's that very spot that gave you the soy that you need to be making these fuels. It's that the expansion of the agricultural model to produce commodities for food, for animal feed, and for fuel is what is driving deforestation. So for instance, with soy, there's two main products that come from harvesting soy. You get the soy meal for livestock feed, and you get the soy oil for human consumption, which we use in a lot of foods, and increasingly for biofuel production. So we know that there's no question that the increased demand for soy is strongly associated with deforestation. There's also a lot of links between the livestock industry and soy agriculture. For instance, we have instances where the soy producer will say, well, we're not responsible for the deforestation because we are planting on already degraded lands. But it was the livestock industry that degraded those lands, that cut down the forests to be able to put their cattle on it. And the soy industry is then trying to wash their hands of responsibility for that. But we find that they're oftentimes very interlocked, including if you go further up the chain in terms of who's investing in these companies that are, involved with the livestock industry and with the agriculture, soy industry, that they're really oftentimes linked all the way back to the same investors. So global deforestation is a major issue for not only, the survival of these really intricate and amazing ecosystems, but also for human, sustainability on this planet. To put it out there, that about 30% of the original forest cover of the planet remains to us. But the danger is that even if we were to stop using fossil fuels tomorrow, if we deforested the rest of the planet and lost that last 30% of original primary forest, old growth forest cover, that it would shoot us way past any of the temperature thresholds that have been identified as, the safe level for warming on the planet. So protecting global forests remains an imperative. And so in that sense, we, really try to push back on the characterization of these aviation biofuels as being climate friendly, because there's no way that any sort of energy source that is a driver of global deforestation can be in any way characterized climate friendly. Another issue beyond just the environmental impacts when it comes to soy that I briefly want to touch upon, because this as well goes into a whole nother field that merits a lot of study, but that is the increased use of genetically modified soy, in particular, genetically modifying soy so that it is what they call Roundup ready. And Roundup is very commonly used herbicide with a main ingredient of glyphosate, which is moderately toxic to humans, but it also has several other ingredients, and it is that cocktail of ingredients that makes Roundup a real public health problem. And so a lot of the communities that are living on these landscapes that have been converted to monoculture soy production are living incredible public health crises with high incidences of cancer and other issues that can be associated to exposure to those pesticides. So relying on soy as an energy source really is a bit of a climate dead end. It's not just soy. I haven't spoken a whole lot about what's going on with palm oil, but we did, when we were in that campaign around the tropical forest offset mechanism here in California, we also worked really closely with activists in Indonesia, because ICAO, which I mentioned, the International Civil Aviation Organization, they basically promote two mechanisms for reducing the climate impact of flying. One is offsetting, and the other one is biofuels. And so we worked really hard on this campaign and connected internationally. And in Indonesia, then there's a strong push by the government to make liquid fuels from palm oil, which is increasing demand for the palm oil commodity, which means that the deforestation in Indonesia has continued unabated because of the expansion of the palm oil model. Now, in California or here in the US, there's actually some prohibitions on using palm oil for making liquid fuels, although there are issues of fraud in terms of virgin palm oil being characterized as used cooking oil and then coming into the States and being used for making fuels. But what we want people to understand, again, is the market elasticities. So if we increase the use of soy for making liquid biofuels, that means that less soy is available for making food and other products that rely on that soy oil. And so there's been a correspondent increase in the amount of palm oil being imported into the United States to be used in food products, and an increase again in the demand for these commodities is what's driving global deforestation. So as I say, we don't use palm oil in United States biodiesel, not directly, but again, it's those indirect relations that can drive the environmental harms. So I'm getting a bit closer to the end of the presentation. I just want to share a few more slides now. These next two slides are from some work from a colleague here in the Bay who is, really in a lot of ways our go-to refinery technical expert as a forest defender. It's been crazy how over the last 5 years, I've learned so much about how petroleum refineries work or what it takes to keep them running. But this is about the biofuel conversion issue, the refinery conversion to biofuel issue here in California. And my colleague put together this graph. So to take a look, that this green line shows in millions of acres the land mass of Indiana. Okay. But here we have the black is how much feedstock but would be required for the Phillips 66 refinery and the Marathon refinery just here in the Bay. But then there's another refinery in Bakersfield, and the World Energy Altair refinery and Paramount are all demanding these feedstocks. Okay, and so we can see then if it's, for instance, just soybean oil that is used at the Phillips 66 and Marathon refineries, it would require soy that would be equal to the total land area of Indiana. So these are massive amounts of feedstocks that are required, massive amounts of land that are required for making these fuels. And this takes us back to the inequities again, because if it's the richest people of the world that are flying, and they're the ones then who are using up all of this land to produce commodities to make the fuels for them to fly, not only are they then using up the atmosphere because they're the ones who are polluting the atmosphere, but they're also the ones who are, for their consumption, appropriating tremendous amounts of land. Another take home for folks to remember is that you'll often hear that bioenergy is replacing fossil fuel energy. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, this is an issue that plagues a lot of renewable energy development, and the fact that we're not actually getting off of fossil fuels when we start building out renewable energy. There needs to be a much stronger effort to reduce our use of fossil fuels and then also be building out renewable energy, because what we're finding with the biofuel issue as an example is that we may be, as you can see down here, increasing the amount of renewable diesel. Remember, that's the drop-in diesel fuel. But at the same time, overall, the amount of fuel that's being produced in California is growing. And on top of that, another thing that's rarely spoken about when talking about California as a global climate leader, but that we on the ground here in the grassroots are constantly trying to bring to people's attention, is that California is exporting phenomenal amounts of liquid fuels. We see California becoming the gas station to the Pacific. So Guatemala, Chile, Mexico, Korea, all sorts of locales all around the Pacific Rim are taking liquid fuels from the California refinery sector. So this is why Greg talked about throwing biofuel on the fire. We're just burning more fuel when we pivot towards these biofuels, because there's no actual effort to reduce the amount of fossil fuel-based liquid fuels. So I'm getting right close to the end now. I wanted to use this image, which is actually very blurry, but to try to really connect again how these refineries are literally directly connected to the aviation sector. So this map shows the pipelines that come from the variety of refineries up here in the northern part of the Bay Area, and then connects those refineries directly to the airports, the Oakland Airport, to SFO, to the San Jose Airport. There's literally pipelines that run from the refineries to the airports. So we've also tried to get more people to see airports and refineries as being one type of infrastructure in itself, that they're not separated, that they're not siloed out, that you begin to see how they are literally connected by pipelines. So I've thrown a whole lot of information at people about the problems with these climate policy mechanisms that are spurring the growth of biofuels, shared some information about why these biofuels are not a climate solution, shared some information about how the aviation industry is trying to, plaster over the concerns that the public has about the climate damage from flying. But I wanted to finish now on a more positive note, even though my presentation isn't going to go into details on this, but to assure people then that when we're working on these matters, we're also really thinking about solutions. We're thinking about alternatives. And so with the Stay Grounded network, there's been an effort to really map out how we pursue this transition. And as they say, lay the tracks towards a fair planet. So I do encourage people who are interested in this material to go ahead and check out the Stay Grounded website and this common destination. It's more than just a report. It's like a whole slew of resources that can be used by grassroots organizers, grassroots advocates, a lot of young people involved with this. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. A slide here with some information about, how to learn more about Biofuelwatch, Global Justice Ecology Project. I didn't really mention Global Forest Coalition, but we do work with this coalition of more than 80 groups in more than 60 countries around the world. And then I just made an allusion to geoengineering, but there is a really dangerous and very worrisome push towards speculative technologies as a means of responding to the climate crisis, which presents a whole lot of dangers for landscapes and communities. But that's pretty much my presentation right there. I tried to throw a lot of information at folks without being overly technical, and I hope that raises some, interest in these matters.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel I could see the changes, and I feel like I solidified my understanding even more of these very technical issues from last semester to this semester. So I thank you. We're at the end of time for class, so in all fairness, I have to let my students go. But if folks have questions, I encourage you to come up, and we can probably keep Gary on for another 5 minutes. Would that be okay?
Certainly.